Good afternoon there. I am Aaron Ramirez from the Special Collections and Museum Services Department of the Pueblo City County Library District here in Pueblo, Colorado. And today I have a special program for you, part of the Revisiting the Founding Era grant program. Welcome to the Life and Times of Alexander Hamilton with Hamilton himself. That's right. This program is brought to you by a generous grant from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History as a part of the Revisiting the Founding Era grant. If you're interested in learning about the founding era through original documents from his time, I will put some of those links in the chat that can touch on some of the topics covered today. But stay tuned for now because I am here to introduce Alexander Hamilton. General Hamilton is a man whom some scholars have called the most brilliant of the founding fathers and the architect of our nation's greatness. Others, however, have called him a monarchist and a militarist. General Hamilton was a self-made man in an era where the term meant much more. He rose from poverty and an ignoble birth to become a general, a leader, and the founder of our economic and legal systems. Perhaps most impressive is the breadth of his service. He served nobly in 3 arenas: in uniform, in office, and with the quill. After serving as Washington's closest aide, General Hamilton earned a combat command where he led his troops from the front and was the first man over the walls during the climactic Battle of Yorktown. He was this nation's first Secretary of Treasury, and at the age of 32. There, he created the foundations of our fiscal system, putting us on the path to economic greatness. He was the principal author of the Federalist Papers, one of the greatest writing on American political thought ever crafted. In his later years, the French politician Talleyrand concluded that the 3 greatest men he had ever met were England's William Pitt, France's Napoleon Bonaparte, and America's Alexander Hamilton. When pressed to rank them further, Talleyrand stated he would have placed Hamilton first. John Marshall once said that when he compared himself to Hamilton, he felt as a candle beside the sun at noonday. His great adversary, Thomas Jefferson, called him the Colossus. John Adams called him far nastier things. Tonight, or this afternoon rather, we are happy to call him our guest as he joins us in the 21st century. General Hamilton will speak for several minutes and then invites your questions on any subject from his era or our own. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Alexander Hamilton.
Well, good day to you, sir.
Good day.
It is a pleasure to join you through what I can only assume is one of Mr. Jefferson's gewgaws and devices. I would certainly prefer to be with you in person, but having survived the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 with some trepidation, I understand that in your day you must be more cautious as you battle your own contagion. So I am pleased to greet you and my fellow Americans. I greet you as Americans because that is the highest praise that I may pay you, American. Not Coloradan or Nebraskan, not New Yorker or Virginian, but American. You see, alone among the founding fathers, I was not cursed with the blessing of having a home state. I was born in the Caribbean under circumstances that were somewhat awkward. But as a result, I became an American first. Among the other founding fathers, Mr. Jefferson, for example, once wrote, "What a difficult thing it is to be 300 miles from one's country." He was in Philadelphia, speaking of his beloved Virginia. In the library of books at Monticello, the magnificent library that Jefferson maintained, he kept the law books of the other states under the headings Foreign Lands. And as President of the United States, Mr. Jefferson referred to the government in Washington City as the Foreign Department. I believe Mr. Jefferson would like us to say the United States are. I believe we must always say the United States is. I find states to be jarring, jealous, and perverse. Your rights as an American should not vary upon the accident of the geography of your birth. And I'm pleased to be with you for several reasons. Certainly, it is a pleasure to speak to you in the great American West, a land I did not visit in life, but I knew we were destined to occupy. I once wrote that the salvation of this nation depends upon men who are continental in their thinking. Mr. Jefferson believed that it would take some 900 years for the first settlers from the East to reach your Pacific coast, your California. I believed him far too pessimistic. I believed we would see villages within 300 years on the Pacific coast. So what a pleasure to see how remarkably you have achieved in much shorter time. I'm certainly pleased to be with you, frankly, to correct the historical record. I know that some of you watching this today are watching in schools, and I would urge those who are students to rise up and leave and never return. Schools create far too much misunderstanding. And it is not your teacher's fault, for they were taught poorly. The founding fathers are often taught as iconic figures of white marble. This is a flaw, because of my generation and yours, we were just simple men like everyone else. Certain ones were remarkable, like General Washington. And I understand that when I say his name, many of you think of a mountain in remote Dakota where his visage appears, or perhaps a marble statue in Washington City. And as his closest aide and a man who was essentially like a son to him, I once said that he is the most horrid swearer and blasphemer, a man capable of purple and volcanic rages. I believe this makes General Washington more interesting and not less. All too often in your day, history is taught as names and dates to memorize and not the passions of the people involved. Let me give you an example. At the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, we had a cowardly general, General Lee, who was leading our troops against the Brits. And they were failing. The Brits were driving our Americans back. And as General Washington and I arrived on horseback, General Lee rode up and said, "Your men, sir, they will not fight." And General Washington, filled with an anger, and he said to him, "You goddamn paltroon," which means coward, "you have not tested them." And together we rode forward into battle, the general rising the troops to victory and pushing back the Brits. And in that battle, 2 buttons were shot from General Washington's coat. Can you imagine how American history would have turned if a single British soldier had aimed 2 inches to one side? Frankly, without General Washington, you would all be Canadians today. And so I'm pleased to be with you to correct the historical record. You often in your day speak of founders' intent. I'm here to tell you there is no such thing. For whatever belief, whatever value, whatever goal you may have, you can probably find a founder who would seem to align themselves with you. We were a disparate group with a number of views. Now, I will say that I made the mistake, frankly, of dying before my enemies. In that situation, your enemies write your history, and this is not a good thing. As I said, my birth was somewhat awkward. My parents were married, not to one another. My mother had fled her first husband, a man she was forced to marry at 16, a man who beat her regularly and was a vile, horrible human being. She fled and met my father, James Hamilton, who was a delightful, if somewhat irresponsible man, and they together had 2 children, my older brother and myself. My records, because of my illegitimacy, were marked in red letters with the phrase, "obscene child," so that I would not be allowed into what you would consider your public schools, where my presence as a bastard might somehow contaminate the other children. One cannot help but be shaped by one's upbringing. My great adversary, Mr. Jefferson's first sentient memory is being carried on a silken pillow by a slave woman. Mine is growing up in utter poverty in the Caribbean, on an island with 600 whites and 15,000 enslaved Africans. I grew up with an intense loathing of slavery and an intense passion to achieve through my own abilities. But having been born into these awkward circumstances of dubious birth, I had few opportunities available to me. One of them was the military. And I wrote in my first extant letter to my friend Ned Stevens that I would risk my life but not my character to exalt my station. Neddy, I wish there was a war. My opponents have often said that that made me a militarist, but in fact it was simply noting that I had few opportunities to achieve. And so I only had the power of my own intellect and my own self-discipline. Now, I should explain at the beginning that I am not a modest man. I once wrote to a friend that I am aware of my gifts and talents. I only wonder why I am not more handsome. And I went to the United States, then the colonies, at the insistence of my teachers and my supporters who believed that I must be properly educated. The plan was that I would attend the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. I approached and spoke to the headmaster and said, I am, how shall I put this, better than other students that you have had. And I wish to be admitted to your school as a student on special status. I wish to take the courses that I wish in the order and manner that I wish. And when I am finished, I will tell you, and you may award me my degree. Now, the headmaster was willing to do this, but he took this proposal to what you would call a board of trustees. The board of trustees remembered a young man several years my senior who had attempted a similar plan of study and had frankly suffered what one might call a nervous breakdown from the stress. His name was James Madison. And so I was declined admission. And in my irritation, I applied to what one might consider the opposite school, called King's College in New York, now known as Columbia University, where I was welcomed, although I did not graduate because of taking up arms in the Revolutionary War. I will say by the time I was 40 years old, I had received honorary degrees from Harvard and Brown and Dartmouth and others. And I did have one further intercourse with Princeton University. At the Battle of Princeton, I was a captain of artillery with some 60 cannon under my command. And at that time, the only major building on the campus was a large stone structure called Nassau Hall, which I am told still stands in your day. And I had observed that the British military leadership had taken refuge in the Great Hall, Nassau Hall, making it a legitimate military target. And as I mentioned that I had some 60 cannon at my disposal, one could only wonder what to do. I ordered an attack, and at least in one form on that day, I achieved an admission to Princeton University in a rather dramatic form. I am also pleased to be with you because I will tell you this. At the end of my life, a dark and deep shadow had fallen across it. Personally, I had found myself in debt, and certainly not to the extent of Mr. Jefferson, mind you. I had purchased some 30 acres of farmland in Harlem, and in 3 years had successfully raised a crop of strawberries and asparagus valued at some $18. I would write to a friend that I am as ill-suited to be a farmer as Mr. Jefferson is suited to be at the head of the nation. More tragically, my firstborn son, Philip, a young man of remarkable capability, of only 18 years, he had attended a theater session. Now, I must explain. When one grows up with nothing, one's name is all that one has. One's sense of honor is all that one has. I had become quite prickly about any insults or attacks on me. I was involved in some 11 affairs of honor, only one of which ended in a duel. But I was constantly defending my honor, and my son Philip therefore felt the need to defend mine. At that theater that evening, he heard a man named George Aker, well into his cups, bragging and boasting and carrying on. And he had, as part of his statements, stated that he believed that I, General Hamilton, would be delighted to have a military coup take over the United States. Now, having fought for the revolution, having had 2 horses shot from under me, defending liberty, of course, I was offended, and my son was outraged. Mr. Aker was a man in his mid-30s, my son a lad of 18, and the squabble induced. If Mr. Aker had any character at all, he would have understood he was dealing with a man just past his childhood. But instead, without my knowledge, it devolved into a duel. And in 1802, on the same dueling grounds where I would later meet Aaron Burr, my son and Mr. Aker met. I'd given my son only one piece of advice about dueling. I said, a gentleman throws away his fire. That is to say, one aims his pistol in the air above him, not straight up, but over the head of the adversary, to indicate I could choose to aim at you if I wished, but as a point of honor, I will fire over your head and stand here against your fire should you choose to shoot. Honorable men would both fire over each other's head. At my son's duel with Mr. Aker, upon the command present, when if one intends to kill, one fires quickly, a full minute passed with pistols raised, until my son raised his pistol to the sky and Mr. Aker fired. My son was mortally wounded and would die the next day in a bed with myself on one side and my grieving wife on the other. Distraught, heartbroken. My eldest daughter, Angelica, very close to her brother, would lose her mind with grief over the loss of Philip. And for the remaining 50 years of her life, she would wear the clothing of 1802 and sit at the pianoforte playing the songs of that year over and over. When she finally died, one of her sisters remarked on her sad and wasted life. So privately, my life was in ruins. Publicly, my great adversary, Mr. Jefferson, had become president of the United States. And more galling than that simple fact was that he'd become president with my aid when his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, demonstrated yet again his lack of honor and attempted to seize the presidency. If there is a question on that later, I will give a more full response. But Mr. Burr was disheartened, and I had helped. I had intervened. I had written a letter to help Mr. Jefferson ultimately become president. I said of Mr. Jefferson that it is true that his politics are tinctured with fanaticism, that he has been a principal enemy of the major efforts of our previous administration, that he is not scrupulous about his facts nor mindful of the truth, and he is a contemptible hypocrite. But, I wrote, he has far less dangerous a man, and he has pretensions to character. By every scrupulous and virtuous calculation, Mr. Jefferson is to be preferred. Mr. Jefferson became the president. Mr. Burr became further and further disgruntled. And so in my private and my public life, this shadow had fallen across me. And I could not know if that shadow was a long winter's night or a brief eclipse. What a pleasure to be back in your day to see that it was but the briefest of eclipses. You are today a thoroughly Hamiltonian nation. You cling to a Jeffersonian veneer, the Jeffersonian magic. His words as a philosopher were remarkable. In practical effect, he was far more flawed, but you cling to his music while becoming a Hamiltonian nation, a nation built on industry and manufacturing, and a nation that understands the importance of a banking system and of good credit. Mr. Jefferson would have us live in an agrarian utopia where 9 in 10 of us lived on farms, and we would barter with our neighbors for those handful of items that we could not make ourselves. And in the evenings, we would read Livy in the original, and we would play our violins. And I am sometimes asked in your day, would we not be better off living in Mr. Jefferson's agrarian utopia rather than in the Hamiltonian nation in which you find yourself? And I say that depends. When I'm speaking to an audience in person, I will say, you must understand the cost of living in Jeffersonian agrarian utopia. You must give up the products of a mechanized society. And I will say, would you give up your entertainment machines? And the parents always say yes, and that they only use them to listen to something they call PBS. And then I ask if they will give up the refrigeration of their food stocks. And they pause. And then I ask if they will give up their children's antibiotics, a product of an industrialized society. And they pause. Mr. Jefferson had 6 children, 4 of whom died in their early youth for conditions and illnesses that in your day are cured by a single visit to a physician. He lost another daughter in childbirth and would write that all he is hangs by a single thread. These are the things you must give up to live in Mr. Jefferson's agrarian utopia. And so I am pleased to see you in this day, a nation that has become thoroughly Hamiltonian, and is because of that, has become the strongest, the safest, the richest, the best educated, the most remarkable nation in the history of the world. And I flatter myself you owe some of that credit to me. You have the longest surviving written constitution in the history of the world. Now, I will tell you that the Constitution has many flaws. I know that in your day it is seen as sacred. In my day, I said of it that it is a frail and worthless fabric that I have spent decades propping up, a thing of milk and water. It had many important concepts, but for example, its flaws include a dangerous and foolish attachment called the Bill of Rights. But ultimately, that Constitution surviving to this day has created a framework within which the American people can thrive. And so I am able to see that the shadow that fell over my life was but the briefest of eclipses, and that you are today a nation in the bright sunlight, leading the world in so many different ways. Fundamentally, Mr. Jefferson and I disagreed in one area. Everything else stems from this single disagreement. Mr. Jefferson believed that man is basically good, and that if government is able to get out of the way, great things are possible. I said in Federalist 6 that man is vindictive and rapacious. We are a greedy lot. We are selfish. But with adequate government structures, greatness is possible. Now, clearly, Mr. Jefferson's illusion is far more appealing than my reality. But I would ask you, those who may still count yourselves as Jeffersonians, did you lock the door of your home last evening or the last time you left your house? If you live in Jefferson's world, you need no locks. But if you locked your door, you are a Hamiltonian, whether you choose to admit it or not. Man is selfish, but capable of greatness. And with that, sir, I believe we have a manservant who is going to aid in the process of questions and thoughts and comments. And I would encourage him at this time to pass along any thoughts he may have from people who may be attending. I'd be very happy to speak with you.
Thank you. Thank you, General Hamilton. That was edifying and a much appreciated account. I have
a 6-hour speech on the Constitution, and I can repeat that for you if you wish.
I think we were scheduled for much less, so maybe another time.
We'll do it again another time.
Okay, excellent. So I have some questions here. This is from Sharon, a colleague here at the Library District. How did you come up with the ideas for the Federalist Papers? Out of thin air? Your manifesto in serial form? Or were you reacting to events?
Yes.
All of the above.
The Federalist Papers, which in your day have become what one might call sacred political documents. They are considered, these 85 documents are considered to be really the creed, the core of what it was to be Americans in our era. And there is a great deal of truth in that. I was the principal author. I wrote roughly 2/3. Mr. Madison wrote the other third, essentially, minus about a half a dozen that Mr. Jay wrote. Mr. Jay was to write on Ford entanglements. He had an attack of gout, which rendered him unable to continue. Mr. Madison was to write on historical guidance we might receive from looking at confederations in the past, the idea Roman, Greek, others that we might learn from. And my task was to guide the readers basically through the entire Constitution, concept by concept, and explaining why these were important ideas. And the critical notion you must understand is that at that time, Mr. Jefferson and the other anti-federalists, those who did not want a strong national government, who supported the Articles of Confederation, the failed system under which we operated for nearly a decade. That was the Articles of Confederation were a response to the authority of the king in England. We had a Hobbesian, if you recall your philosophy, Hobbes believed that without some kind of Leviathan, some monstrous power, life would be solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And so as a result, kings ruled with an iron hand. Jefferson's brilliant Declaration of Independence, I will always state the brilliance of it, the remarkable 36 words that changed the world, which begin with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," are remarkable. I said before, he is a remarkable philosopher. But he believed in this Articles of Confederation, which was a response to the too strong king-based government. As a result, under the Articles, each state was considered essentially a sovereign nation. Checkpoints would be set up between New Jersey and New York. Crossing a bridge into Manhattan, one would be required to change their New Jersey money to New York money. Taxes were charged. It was a completely unworkable system. At one point, Mr. Morris, who was the Minister of Finance under this, asked New York to please send the money to the federal government, small that it was, that it had promised, so that it might be able to defend the coasts against invasion. New York's response was essentially, in the parlance of your day, no, we won't. And it was recognized that there was a need to have the government somewhere between the autonomous power of a Leviathan, a king, and the ridiculous powerlessness of the Articles of Confederation. And a number of us had these ideas. I flatter myself I was the leader in many of these ways. We initially held a conference in Annapolis, Maryland, where we did not actually have a quorum. We did not have enough states attending to give us the 7 of 9 needed under the Articles of Confederation to actually do any business. We pretended that we did. And we essentially, at that Annapolis meeting, called for a convention in Philadelphia in the summer of '87, which would fix, repair, alter, improve the Articles of Confederation. Now, there were many that believed the Articles could be improved. I believe that they were without merit and needed to be replaced entirely by a constitution creating a strong national government. And so the Philadelphia Convention went on. I spoke a great deal. I attended. I wrote. I gave the 6-hour speech I mentioned. I left. I came back. It was a remarkable event, and I encourage all your listeners and readers to pick up a book in your local library to learn more about the convention. Again, I can go on for 6 hours, but I shall resist the urge.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. Yes.
You're welcome. But I am not finished, sir. Please do not interrupt.
I'm terribly sorry.
Manservants are so difficult to get these days that are of quality work. And so, once the convention was in the past, we were faced with a reality that a significant portion of the American population did not understand why the Articles of Confederation were flawed and why a new constitution would, in fact, protect their liberties better with a strong central government than a weak state government would. The notion was balancing the concepts of liberty and order. And for most of human society, it was believed that small government close to the people was the best protector of your liberty. Mr. Jefferson believed in what he called ward republics, where groups of perhaps 20 farmers would be the lowest level of government to decide what happened within their area, and each succeeding level would become larger and less powerful. I believed that it was vital that a strong national government be created, which could have speed, energy, and dispatch in terms of acts of governance. And so the Federalist Papers, publishing roughly 2 a week, Mr. Madison and I initially began to send them back and forth for critiques that quickly became unworkable because of the pace of writing. 2 a week published in the newspapers of that day, explaining why a large government was a better protector of liberty than a small. And I will give Mr. Madison credit for the remarkable Federalist number 10, in which he explains very carefully why a large government is the most important. We worried about what we call the danger of faction, which today you would call special interest groups. And Mr. Madison cleverly wrote the truth, which is that faction is sown in the nature of man. We are inherently divisive. And so the only way to remove faction would be to give everyone the same opinion or eliminate all liberty. The first is impossible. The second is the antithesis of our goal. Therefore, one must settle for controlling the impact, the effects of faction. And the way you do that is not by having a small ward republic in which one person could dominate, but rather have a large society in which there are so many groups battling for power that no one group can ever get too powerful, because that group will be opposed by other groups also fighting for power. We will seize on to the very nature of man to be selfish, to be vindictive, to be rapacious, and we will turn that to the strength of keeping America free. And so the Federalist Papers were created to explain to the American people why their rights were better protected in a large republic than a small one. And so Mr. Madison, writing about the great historical confederations and organizations and empires, myself, as I say, writing about the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, if you will, of the Constitution, Mr. Jay writing to some degree about foreign stuff, although I also wrote in that. The notion was to cover all of the arguments that might be used by the anti-federalists to oppose the Constitution. As it turned out, in each state's ratifying convention, in some states we had great difficulty, in some states no difficulty at all. In Virginia, it passed 30 to 27. In another state, Massachusetts, it passed 168 to nothing. So it varied tremendously by the state. And in some states like mine, New York, we had to compromise of promising to apply, as I said, this silly and dangerous notion of a Bill of Rights. That was the last refuge of the scoundrels called anti-federalists. If they could get what they thought was a Bill of Rights attached, which is a foolish and dangerous idea. I will pontificate on that if the question is asked. But fundamentally, that became the compromise. And so the Federalist Papers were, in our day, political propaganda to persuade the American people of the merits of the Constitution. What you have turned them into in your day is your responsibility, not mine.
Thank you, sir. I have a question here from Steve S. Through the YouTube channel. Is it annoying to you that the musical based on your life has attracted so much attention? Has it affected how much your audience seems to know about you?
I mentioned before that I am not a modest man. And I think my response would be, it's about time. There was a historian in your day who once wrote that there is no monument to Hamilton on the National Mall in Washington. And until one is built, we shall have to settle for the other monuments to the Hamiltonian vision, the interstate highway system and Wall Street, the Department of Defense and the Supreme Court, the laws and economics of this nation. And I will accept that as adequate tribute until a proper sculpture is put on the National Mall.
Very interesting. Thank you, sir. Let's see.
I will also say that when my portrait was being taken, I did say to the portraiteur that I wish that he would ensure that he gives proper credit to the length of my nose. It meant in my day what I suspect it means in yours.
I see. I see that. We have a question here from Cynthia. What is one life tip you'd like to share? How can we be more like Hamilton?
Well, it is very simple to lead a Hamiltonian life. One need only do the following. Read 12 hours each day. Learn a variety of language. Devour every book you can lay your hands on. Write about that which fascinates you at great length, and constantly study to become a better person. Understand that being carried on a silken pillow is more of a burden than a blessing in some ways. When I speak of Mr. Jefferson, I criticize him for many things. I do not criticize him over slavery. He once said, "It is holding a wolf by the ears. We cannot hold on, but we dare not let go." And so I think that if you wish to live a Hamiltonian life, one need only study relentlessly. In fact, I gave my son, Philip, when he was at school, several rules in which I controlled every hour of his day until 8 o'clock in the evening, when I gave him an hour on some days to read at his leisure, not read what I required him to read, law, mathematics, philosophy, physics, astronomy, but rather he could read anything he wished for that hour. But nonetheless, he was reading the entire time. I would encourage you to leave school and engage in self-education. You should become a constant presence at your local library where you devour everything one can read. You should apprentice to a lawyer, perhaps, if that is your interest. In my day, I'm told in your day, how long does it take to become a lawyer, Mr. Ramirez?
I believe it's 4 years. Is that
4 years,
right?
3 years, 4 years. I cannot imagine why anyone would waste that much time. When I became a lawyer, I apprenticed to a lawyer in New York City and read in his law library for some 6 months. I then took the bar and passed and became one of 87 lawyers in the city of New York. At that time, that was 1/12 the number of prostitutes. I am told that in your day, that ratio has reversed, and it is not entirely clear that the society has improved.
Who can say, honestly? Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very informative. So I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. Are you ready for a substantial one, a substantial question?
I am a substantial individual.
All right, here we are. This is from Jonathan. One of the biggest differences between Hamilton and other influential founders was his stance in favor of a powerful centralized government like Great Britain.
Yes.
How would you compare the way Alexander Hamilton feared anarchy in a limited government versus the way Thomas Jefferson feared tyranny in an activist government?
Well, I would simply point out that Mr. Jefferson is wrong. And as evidence of his wrongness, I will use as my examples the totality of human history. Name a single society which sought to be a utopia that did not descend into dictatorship. When one believes in limited government because man is good, one inevitably leaves open the door to a demagogue. A person who would rather, imagine in your day, if an individual, now I wrote in, for example, in Federalist 68, I wrote about the Electoral College and how one of its most important functions would be to keep men of low character and without qualification from achieving high office. We assumed that the Electoral College would not simply rubber stamp whatever the people had voted on, because the people, forgive me, are amenable to demagogues. And as a result, we put a series of brakes on the popular passion into the Constitution. One of these we assumed would be the Electoral College, preventing someone unqualified by education, by temperament, by intellect from ever achieving what I called the role of chief magistrate. Now, this is only possible in a powerful central government. The Electoral College failed its task, some would argue, and I would ask you, are you the better off for that Jeffersonian window in which someone could come through? I would ask you, when you are dealing with your children, and it is a matter of great importance, do you take a vote on what you shall have for dinner that evening, or what tasks they will perform to clean around the home? Or do you dictate because you are in your family that strong central government? We elect our strong central government. We create opportunities to recall them. We assumed that you would use the impeachment process far more often than you do. It was used by Mr. Jefferson on a couple of occasions with the Supreme Court. In one case, to rid the court of a person who was quite mad. This individual would have conversations with individuals no one else could see. Another case, it was more of a political notion. But we assumed that you would use the tool to pull people from office if they proved to be incompetent. I shall take no blame if in your day you have chosen to forego this protection. But a strong central government is, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the critical protection of your personal liberty. When one crosses the border from New York into Massachusetts, from Florida into Georgia, from Colorado into Nebraska, one's rights should not change. Because first and foremost, you are an American. And when those rights change, that is a flaw induced by a Jeffersonian lower level government thinking they're protecting your liberty when in fact it is quite the opposite. So it's only in a strong central government that your rights are truly protected. Mr. Jefferson was simply wrong. Shall we have one more brief question, if I promise to answer in fewer paragraphs?
Sure, absolutely. If you have time, of course. This would be good, I think. I'd like to hear this. Industrialization and capitalism have led to incredibly powerful and influential multinational corporations based here. Do these organizations threaten the functioning of the federal government?
The larger question would be, does any actor on the world stage that has tendrils into our nation pose a risk to that nation?
Yes.
Be that a large corporation in your day, or be that France in ours? And the answer, of course, is yes. And that is why I would simply say we gave you the tools through a legislature. In fact, in the Federalist Papers we marked about earlier, there is a specific sentence which reads, in such a republic, the legislature by definition dominates. This is because of the law-making power. We assumed that the power to make laws would always be the most important, strongest power in government. And as a result, we cleaved the lawmaking body in half, gave them alternate methods of election to try to have them basically battle each other. Within the House, we had them battle within each other by districts within their states in the hope that they would not predominate too radically. I'm told in your day, your legislature has decided to shift a great deal of its power to the presidency. This was not our intention. The president, because of his ability to employ secrecy, energy, and dispatch, is a vitally important concept, especially in times of crisis. The president's ability to act quickly, aggressively, and firmly is vital in a crisis. But we assumed that the lawmaking branch would take care of these larger issues such as this foreign entanglement. It would seem to me that there are easy remedies to this. The tax code. As you know, I was essentially the founder of your economic system, and our taxes relied almost entirely on, at that time, tariffs on products coming into the United States to these large companies. We assume that you in your day would govern properly and control these entities as we did. If you have failed to do that, I would urge you to vote out those who have failed to do the proper job and vote in those that will. And I'm told that in your day, most people hate the Congress, and yet every election cycle return 9 of 10 of them to office. One cannot do that if one actually wishes to see change. So I'd encourage the person who asked this question, first, write letters, and second, run for Congress, and encourage your other friends to do as well. And so I think I will conclude, sir, by just saying this. You have a disadvantage being in your 21st century. Because when you look back on the founding period, when you look back on the Revolutionary War, you know that America won. But at that time, we were taking on the greatest military power the world had ever known for a radical new idea that all men are created equal. That their rights do not come from a king giving them their rights, but simply because they breathe. If they breathe, they are free. And that governments exist to keep people free, safe, and prosperous. Those are those remarkable 36 words I mentioned earlier from the Declaration. You are the sons and daughters of revolutionaries who took on this great military power with perhaps 25% popular support, with Brown Bess muskets, fighting for their very lives on the principle that freedom is worth the fight. And I'm told that in your day, half of you often do not even bother to vote in an election. You are the spawn of a generation steeped in war for the principle of freedom, for the principle of liberty. I urge you to engage with your government at all levels, to engage with your fellow citizens, and remember your inheritance. You will recall that at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Dr. Franklin was asked, "What kind of government have you given us?" His response was, "A republic, if you can keep it." I urge you, in your day, keep up the fight to keep the republic. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, General Hamilton. And now, I'm pleased to introduce the scholar behind the character. Hal Bleck is a retired career military officer. During his years in the military, he served as deputy director of the Air Force Institute for National Security Studies, was posted to the United States Department of State in Washington, and was an ICBM launch officer and instructor. He also served at the White House as director of global environmental affairs for the National Security Council. He spent much of his career teaching political science at the United States Air Force Academy. Following his retirement, he served on the staff of a United States senator and as a senior research fellow at DC-based think tanks. He holds academic degrees from the University of Michigan, including a doctorate in political science. He regularly portrays General Hamilton around the country. His work as Hamilton has been seen on both national and local television. His performances have been seen in auditoriums, libraries, and museums around the country. He has performed Hamilton for a wide array of audiences, including federal judges, school children, and historians. Please welcome Hal Bleck. Hi, Hal.
Well, hi, Aaron. Thank you. This is one of those weird online things where it's both wonderful and also kind of sad. But it's great to be able to. I am the son of a librarian, so I have great reverence for libraries and their role. This is an area where Jefferson and I agree completely. I think it's kind of important to do this out of character part in this, what we call the Chautauqua Method, because I can talk about some things Hamilton got right and some things Hamilton got wrong. I think the history shows Hamilton was mostly correct on most of these things, but he was wrong on some things. He was wrong on the Bill of Rights. Now, his argument against the Bill of Rights was a good one, that if you list rights, a future demagogue becoming a leader could say that this listed right, these are the only ones you've got. The First Amendment says you've got freedom of speech. It doesn't say anything about freedom of protest sign, freedom of song, freedom of picketing. So there are dangers, Hamilton argued, in listing rights. He also argued that there were a number of rights already in the Constitution. No bills of attainder, no working title, no working to corruption of the blood, which is my favorite. I always ask my students at the academy, what does it mean to work a corruption of the blood? And the answer is to punish a son for the crimes of his father. That's specifically outlawed in our Constitution. No titles of nobility, a few others. So Hamilton's arguments in his day were pretty powerful. And so I think it's a very interesting thing to look at Hamilton. And I've been doing this a long time before the musical starts. And it's interesting, which is a great musical. I love it. I actually did a performance in San Antonio, Texas, as Hamilton. And then the next night crossed the street to a different theater and saw the Broadway show, Hamilton, which was, I did not wear the costume, although I was tempted. But he's such an interesting guy because I think he celebrates what is the very best about America in terms of being a self-made man. He overcame obstacles that are breathtaking to consider. The bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, as Adams called him. And so what he achieved is stunning. he also shows the great flaws. Washington, Jefferson, Adam, all those guys had people trying to fight duels with them, and they were able to ignore it because it was stupid. Hamilton had that prickly sense of honor where anyone questioning him, he saw this serving on Washington's staff in the Revolutionary War. He was asked, he was constantly attacked in the press for being a variety of things, monarchist, Washington's brain, nothing. He did not take it well. He would have done poorly in the era of attack ads on television because he simply couldn't let it go. And that was his ultimate downfall, was his inability to not defend himself against what he saw was an outrageous attack on his honor by Aaron Burr. And there's a whole, we need to do this again sometime and do the Mariah Reynolds affair and the Aaron Burr stuff, because it's an amazing history, an amazing part of Hamilton's story. But It's a pleasure to be with you, and I thank you very much for putting up with me, and I'm impressed with the technology working so well.
Yes, we've been getting by, and I really appreciate your time and joining us here, so we can add the internet to those list of venues there.
You can indeed.
Yes.
There's probably someone in Kyrgyzstan watching right now. Who knows?
Maybe. And so along those lines, this performance will be archived through the YouTube channel and our Facebook channel page. So if you'd like to watch this again, it'll be up probably tomorrow. And yeah, is there anything that you'd like to add in closing?
Just my great appreciation to you and Ann and the others at the library for work. I know it's always a pain in the butt to set this kind of thing up, but I think it's important to do this. Again, I'm sometimes asked why I think this Chautauqua method works. And I think there's two reasons. The first is to show that these were real people with real passions. I mean, when you hear about Washington calling another general a goddamn coward and charging into musketball fire, that makes him a real person, makes him more interesting, not less. And the other thing is, none of the issues debated at the Philadelphia Convention have been settled. North, South, rich, poor, big state, small state, gender, race, wealth, poverty, all those issues are still with us. We, at best, have come up with a system of managing them imperfectly, but we haven't settled anything. So the very same questions that people ask in our presidential and congressional debates today, our city council campaigns, are the same questions asked in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. So it just shows that the American creed is alive and well and hasn't changed that much, even though it's got some cool electronic gadgets now.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time again. And maybe next time we see you, we'll all be in person.
I look forward to it.
Okay. Thanks, Hal. Have a great day.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.